it's part two of the development of Hebrew and how it became the official language of the State of Israel. And to continue with part two is Professor Kalman Weiser that you have met last week. So I will just invite him to start. Kalman, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for having me, and thank you for joining us tonight. So I will get to business. I'll share my screen. My daughters complained that I was too loud last week, but what am I going to do? If I'm distracted occasionally by angry text messages, it's coming from an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old. But here we go. Okay, so last time I told you I was going to divide the lectures into two. Actually, let me start the slideshow. I need to do that. The first lecture was about really the literary revival of Hebrew in the diaspora, which really means in this context, Eastern Europe, beginning in the late 18th century and continuing to the 19th century. And we talked about the introduction in the 20th century of Hebrew into secular schools in Eastern Europe as the language of instruction. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the other half of the story, and in some ways, the more significant part of the story. That is, how did Hebrew become a spoken language? And that's a story that really takes place in Eretz-Yisrael, in the land of Israel. So let's get to it. So where we left off and some questions we're going to be exploring tonight. First of all, actually, let me just set my clock so I have know how much time I'm talking, so I don't talk too much. I have a lot to say. Give me a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I spoke about the literary revival last time. I'm telling you today about the spoken revival, which is mainly a phenomenon of Ottoman Palestine and then later the State of Israel. We're going to be talking tonight about really some nuts and bolts issues of how Hebrew was revived as a spoken language, and also to understand it from a sociolinguistic context. Then we're going to sort of ask the question, or this is part of the sociolinguistic discussion, why was the revival successful, and in what ways was it not successful, which is to some extent a subjective question or a subjective analysis. We're going to address the question of what is modern Hebrew? Is it the continuation of biblical Hebrew? Is it Mosaic with a capital M? Or is it Mosaic with a small m, like mosaic of tiles? This is a phrase coined by the linguist Gilad Zuckerman, who specializes in the history of Hebrew's revitalization. And I'll tell you about some of the claims he's made, the controversial claims that he's made that have irritated people in Israel in the last 15 years or so. And finally, we'll talk about the question we began with: is Hebrew a Jewish language? Of course, we'll have to talk about what Jewish means to come up with an answer and what is a Jewish language. Okay, so we're off. So I'd like to start off by talking about the sociolinguistic landscape of 19th century Ottoman Palestine. That is, what did language use look like at this time in this region? I'm showing you here a picture of 3 men. These are men from the old Yishuv. The old Yishuv is the term used for the traditional communities of Jews in Ottoman Palestine. And as you can probably gather from the way they're dressed, that these people represent distinct ethno-cultural communities. One's Ashkenazi, one is probably Sephardic, one is what we might call Mizrahi or something else. They probably don't speak the same language at home. They don't pronounce Hebrew with the same pronunciation. They have cultural differences that are quite apparent in the foods they eat and some other things. If they want to get together, they may be able to communicate in Hebrew, but no one actually goes home and speaks Hebrew to his family, right? Hebrew serves as their lingua franca, but it's not a community language. It's not an everyday language. It's certainly not anybody's native language. The majority of the people speak Arabic, including Jews who speak Judeo-Arabic. Turkish is, of course, the official language of the state. But Jerusalem is itself a very multilingual city. It's a city of many communities, both Jewish and non-Jewish. By the second half of the 19th century, Jews make up the majority of the residents of Jerusalem. but there are many other people there. And I'm including in this not just people who speak Arabic, who are mainly Muslim, some of them Christian, but I'm also talking about speakers of French, Russian, various other European languages, Amharic, because there are so many Christian groups from Europe, Africa, and elsewhere who are represented, as well as diplomatic consuls who are living in Jerusalem by the late 19th century. So it's really a very multilingual city. Part of what Zionism does, you'll probably intuit from what I'm telling you today, is Zionism really makes one language the dominant language of Jerusalem in a way that it wasn't previously. The old Yishuv, as I mentioned before, there are multiple Jewish languages being used, whether it's Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, Yiddish, something else. Hebrew is a lingua franca among Jews, but not an everyday language for people. It's not a native language. We see in the second half of the 19th century a significant rise in Ashkenazic immigration. This is already preceding the Zionist movement. If you were to say the Zionist movement really begins in a serious way in the 1880s, there's already a rise in Ashkenazic immigration beforehand, but particularly with the rise of Zionism in the latter part of the 19th century, we see more and more Ashkenazic Jews coming. And of course, Yiddish is the dominant language amongst these Jews. So why are these Jews coming? Well, in the 1870s, we have a significant immigration of Jews coming to new farming communities. Now, these are not Zionist farming communities. These are communities formed by various European Jewish benefactors, like the Rothschilds, a few major Jewish charitable organizations in Europe. They create farming communities because they're trying to help the poor Jews of Europe and elsewhere. Right at this point, by the late 19th century, Palestine is more easily reachable by steamship. They're beginning to work on things like railroads in the Middle East. There are poor people in Eastern Europe. Why wouldn't they come to Palestine if they're going to Argentina, the United States, or somewhere else? It's another option amongst many options. And of course, to people who have a special feeling for Palestine, for the land of Israel, which is common amongst Jews, it's going to be very attractive. But these communities are mainly being set up to help people get on their feet economically. The children in these communities are usually educated in European languages, whether it's French or some other language. They speak Yiddish at home and have religious instruction in Yiddish usually, but they go to school in French because this is the language of the Rothschilds. It's the language considered appropriate for a modern education. So anything secular is in the European language. Anything religious, Jewish, is going to be in Yiddish for most of these children. Now, I'm going to talk about Eliezer ben Yehuda, and then I'm going to talk about the waves of Zionist immigration, and we're going to see how this situation changes. Now, here you see ben Yehuda, very famous, with his wife, his second wife, Hemda. You're probably familiar with the idea that Eliezer ben Yehuda is the father of modern Hebrew. And this is true really in a symbolic sense, but not so much in a practical sense. His importance really as an ideologue, as a symbol, outweighs his practical achievements, which are considerable, but they're not what really gets Hebrew to become a spoken everyday language. He did not inspire a large nucleus of imitators in his efforts to revive Hebrew as an everyday language. He raised the first Hebrew-speaking child, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. But there were very few other families in Jerusalem where he was living in the 1880s who tried to follow his example. So let's learn a little bit about him before we tell you about what he did. So first of all, his birth name, of course, is not Ben Yehuda. This is the name he gave to himself. He was Eliezer Perelman, which is a traditional Ashkenazic name. And I say the word traditional with a caveat, because of course, there's no such thing as a traditional Ashkenazic name in 1858 when he's born. The Ashkenazic Jews have only had European family names, fixed family names for a few generations. So, maybe only for 50 years or so has his family actually been called Perelman. Giving up his family name to become Ben Yehuda probably didn't mean all that much to him. In fact, most Eastern European Jews only use their family names on government documents through most of the 19th century. But in any case, as a sign of his ideology, he changed his name, he Hebraized it to Eliezer, the son of Yehuda. He was born in 1858 in Belarus. He was from a Hasidic Chabad family. He became enlightened by the Jewish Enlightenment. He ended up going to Paris. And in Paris, he already had nationalist ideas. He actually encountered Hebrew being used as a language for lectures at the Sorbonne, at the university in Paris. He had lunch one day, or at least met in a cafe with another Jew with whom he had a conversation in Hebrew. They were both obviously educated, part of the yeshiva elite. And this convinced him that Hebrew could be revived as a spoken language if we only made the effort. In order for Hebrew to be revived as a spoken language, he believed, Jews needed a land of their own. And this is significant from a sociolinguistic perspective. Hebrew could not be revived amongst a majority population speaking non-Jewish languages or other Jewish languages. It had to be revived in relative isolation. He went to Jerusalem. He wrote about reviving Hebrew in 1879. He ended up going to Palestine to settle in 1881. He moved to Jerusalem, which is probably the worst place to revive Hebrew. He had the right idea, go to a Jewish land. He had the wrong idea in the sense of he really needed to go outside of the cities where Jews lived in order to achieve his mission. But he achieved a number of important things, such as he founded a public organization to support his ideal. This is the Language Committee, founded in 1890, which united a number of intellectuals committed to his endeavor to revive Hebrew, who would engage in various forms of language planning to standardize the language. Over time, and decades later, this would eventually evolve into today's Academy for the Hebrew Language. It would become the Language Committee, Ba'at Lashon, and eventually become the Academy for the Hebrew Language when there was an independent Israel. He established newspapers and journals, including Hatzvi, which is his first newspaper. And of course, he's most famous for creating hundreds of neologisms and a multi-volume dictionary. Many of these words caught on, and they're in use today. Many of them fell by the wayside, as you would expect from any language planner. He raised the first Hebrew-speaking child. You'll hear about him in a minute. He was, however, denounced by the Orthodox authorities of Jerusalem to the Ottoman officials. They suspected him of heresy. After all, he was a secular Jew who was using the holy language for mundane functions. And as far as they were concerned, he needed to be denounced to the authorities as engaged in acts of sedition. He actually posed as a Hasidic Jew for a while, and then he gave that up. By the way, this is his second wife. His first wife died of, I forget what horrible disease right now, whether it was tuberculosis or diphtheria or malaria, but something pretty awful. He remarried her sister, and they had at least 2 children who survived. A number of the children didn't survive, unfortunately. Oh, by the way, Chemda, that wasn't her given name either, by the way. She also Hebraized her name. She also was a coiner of words. If you know the word Chanukia for a menorah, what we call it from Yiddish, Chanukah lampo, a menorah in Yiddish, the Chanukah lamp, there was no word for this in modern Hebrew yet, but Sephardic Jews had Chanukia in Ladino, and she proposed that it be adopted into Hebrew, and it's thanks to her that we have the contemporary word Chanukia, or Chanukiah, I should say. Okay, what you see here is, of course, the first Hebrew-speaking child. This is Ben Zion Ben Yehuda. You probably never heard of him. You've probably heard of instead Itamar Ben Avi. He himself changed his name from his Hebrew name to a new name. He engaged also in an act of recreation that had to do with his ideology and his history. He became Itamar, which means island of dates. Very nice name to deal with, the Middle Eastern context. Son of my father, or the Avi is not only my father, it's also the acronym, the initials, for Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Okay, so he was both the son of my father, i.e., I was created by my father's initiative. I was my father's experiment. I am also the son. I'm also the son of Eliezer Ben Yehuda. And he changed his first name to Itamar. Now, there's a whole series of famous stories, which are largely true, that he was not allowed exposure to any other language in his early years because they wanted him to be uncorrupted. They wanted him to be pure in his knowledge of Hebrew. People thought that the child would grow up to be mentally deficient, that he would never be socially adjusted. And there's a famous story that they realized he was all right when someone, I forget the exact story, but someone either said something or pulled on his ear, and he yelled at those people in Hebrew. And this was, of course, the first, obnoxious Hebrew-speaking child, and both the sign that Hebrew was alive. A child was speaking it. He had no other language. We know that in secret, his mother was occasionally singing to him lullabies in other languages like Russian or Yiddish. We know that he probably heard some other languages occasionally, but they did their best really not to expose him to any other languages. He later went on to become a journalist, a lexicographer in his own right, that is a coiner of words and maker of dictionaries. He helped his father. He was also, and this is interesting, he was a proponent of the romanization of Hebrew, that to be a modern language, we have to do away with the Hebrew alphabet. It's too imprecise. Latin letters are more precise for registering the sounds of the language and would make it easier for non-native speakers to acquire the language. So what you see here are not only photos of him at different phases in his life, you also see his attempt at creating a Romanized Hebrew newspaper, Hashavua HaPalestini. Okay. Now here is where things really begin to take off. I'm going to take you to the first two major waves of immigration, the first two Aliyot, and tell you their contributions to the revival of Hebrew. What you see here is a map of the new Jewish settlements. This is not the old Yishuv, which was mainly concentrated in 4 holy cities and in a few agricultural settlements by the 1870s. This is the new agricultural settlements mainly that are beginning to be created from the 1880s on. Okay, so the first wave of immigration is from 1882 to 1903. And this really begins a revival in a new type of agricultural settlements. We're not yet at kibbutzim, collective settlements. We still have moshavot, but they are no longer dependent upon European aid to survive. The ones of the 1870s relied on these benefactors like Rothschilds, who therefore had a lot of say in their education. These ones were left to stand on their own feet, which meant that they could no longer rely on subsidies. They really had to get their acts together. It was extremely difficult. Many people, in fact, left because life was so difficult. But all in all, somewhere between 25 and 35,000 Jews, mainly from Eastern Europe, to a lesser extent from Yemen, came in this period. And they created the first Hebrew-speaking schools. And this is what's really interesting and significant. Children were taught Hebrew in Hebrew, the Ivrit method, the Berlitz method I mentioned last time. They were taught in the classroom, and you can imagine this, compare it with French immersion here in Canada. The children are all being taught French in French, but as soon as the bell rings, they go outside to play in English here in Toronto. And they often even ask the teachers questions in English. These children were encouraged to speak Hebrew all the time and only Hebrew. Eventually, speaking Hebrew in the classroom speaking Hebrew on the playground, outside the school. As they grew older, they would teach to their siblings, to their parents. Like in any immigrant situation, some of you may have encountered this when you came to Canada, if you were immigrants. Very often, the children come home from school with English and teach it to their parents or help their parents to acquire it. The children were teaching their parents who were already positively inclined to learning Hebrew. They were helping them to improve their Hebrew. As adults, these children were speaking Hebrew with their romantic partners and starting to raise families in Hebrew. And that's something that had never really been seen before. The children made the language their own. Their parents were still very often speaking to them in Yiddish, maybe some other language, but mainly Yiddish. But they were really insistent on speaking Hebrew as much as possible. Now, I gave you a few examples, some significant dates. They're just significant dates. I'm not going to stop and talk about them in great detail. A Romanian Jew, David Idlevich, created the first Hebrew immersion school in Rishon LeZion. By 1891, they were teaching Hebrew in other villages too. You might ask me, how did they get the vocabulary? Before there was a committee for the language, or the committee was well organized. Well, a lot of the words they created themselves, the teachers, the students. Sometimes the villagers got together and communicated. They had to talk about spelling because spelling was not wholly standardized. They had to talk about accent. Do we use Sephardic or Ashkenazi accent? And I'll come back to this later. They worked the things out themselves because they needed to. By 1894, there was a preschool program for 4 to 5-year-olds in Rishon. There was a Hebrew kindergarten in Jerusalem by 1903, and then in several other places. So this was really taking off at a grassroots level. People were voluntarily creating Hebrew schools, and the children were taking it on as their dominant language. And of course, this expanded from the language of the children. This became more and more the language of adulthood, family life, and increasingly the language of society. At first, we're only talking about a few tens, then hundreds, and then thousands. But over time, it became a very significant proportion of the Jews in Palestine. Now, the turning point for all of this is the second Aliyah, from 1903 to 1914, until really, I would say, the period of World War I, right? World War I begins in 1914. That cuts off immigration coming from elsewhere, particularly Europe. So you have this very interesting system that's closed. No one's coming in. It allows Hebrew to percolate during this period. 35,000 Jews come, again, mainly from Eastern Europe, particularly the Russian Empire, some also from Yemen. Those coming from Eastern Europe are socialists for the most part, and they are ideologically committed to a thorough transformation of Jewish life. You're probably familiar with this, so I won't go into great detail, but the whole idea of a Hebrew being rooted in a Hebrew land, farming the Hebrew earth, speaking the Hebrew language, the language of his ancestors, and rejecting all that was associated with the diaspora, including names and language. In fact, literally, they were separating themselves from their families who were now thousands of miles away. These were mainly young people. They were absolutely committed to the Hebrew revival. They agreed to speak Hebrew only in public. That is, in private, they may speak some other language, but when you're in public, you have to speak Hebrew. And they Hebraized their names. David Ben-Gurion is just one of many good examples. Of course, he was David Green in Poland, and he became David Ben-Gurion. They used Hebrew for lectures, for cultural events, for business correspondence. Everything at a formal level and a public sphere had to be in Hebrew. There could be no competition. By the end of World War I, statistics show, and these are, not wholly reliable, but they give us a sense, about 40% of the Jews in Palestine, let's say about 34,000 people, declared in a census that Hebrew was their spoken language. By 1903, there was a teachers' organization that had standardized curriculum. In 1909, we see the birth of the modern city of Tel Aviv, which is billed as the first Hebrew city. Hebrew both in the sense of a modern Jewish city, but also Hebrew in the sense of the first city that uses Hebrew as its language of administration. If you want to get a job as a government functionary in Tel Aviv, you have to be able to function now in Hebrew. In 1913, we have the famous language war. There was a language war in Eastern Europe between Yiddish and Hebrew, but there was also a language war in Ottoman Palestine before World War I. It's centered around the issue of what's now the Technion. The story behind it, you might be familiar with, is that there was a plan by German Jews to create Palestine's first school of higher technical learning. They believed that this should be in German because German was a major language of science, and Hebrew, they believed, was not developed enough yet to have all the words you needed for modern technology, engineering, and so on. The students and teachers revolted. They did not want to let the school open if Hebrew was not the language. And of course, this delayed the opening. The students and teachers eventually won. And this was a public outcry that went beyond the school. And what was going to be the German Technikum became instead the Hebrew Technion, which opened officially in the interwar period. By the way, the poster you see here, which I should have put a little bit later, but it's here. This is one of those posters about the controversy about the language war. I can't see it because I see my face and other people's faces there. But if you look at it, I move my face, you can see it says, the subject of this lecture is the Hebrew language. Hebrew as a language of instruction in schools in the land of Israel. And this was a very controversial subject at the time, and eventually won out, of course. Okay, I want to talk a little bit before we get to the interwar period about the mechanism of how the language was being revived. Right now, I'm just going to focus on words, vocabulary, lexicon. Now, as I said before, this is really a collective endeavor. This is being carried on in Eastern Europe by journalists and writers. It's also being carried on by people like Ben Yehuda. It's also being carried on in the schools, in the agricultural settlements, and eventually in the cities. So this is really something that's extremely important to people living in the land of Israel at this time. They need it for everyday life. So how do you build new words? New words are built on old roots or roots that are borrowed from other Semitic languages. Ben Yehuda was a master of this. He would look in Aramaic, Arabic, Amharic, and find a cognate root, a three-letter root for a Hebrew verb or a noun, and say, they have this word, why shouldn't we have this word? I think, for instance, the word tarikh for date was actually a word he modeled on Arabic, because Arabic already had this root serving in that function. He took the word, if not he, someone else, the word for sulfur, gofrit, and made gafrul for matches, which is very clearly based on the Yiddish word. The Yiddish word for match is a shvebela, which comes from shvebel, which is sulfur. He took the Yiddish word and basically translated it into Hebrew, taking the Hebrew root. That's a common mechanism. That's what we call a calque or a loan translation, where you take words from one language and you take the corresponding parts in another language and create a new word in there in its image. So there are many words like this in modern Hebrew. You take the word iton, meaning newspaper. It's calqued on the German word Zeitung. A Zeitung is formed from the word for time plus an ending that makes for nouns. Iton is formed on the Hebrew word for time plus a noun for endings. Ktavet for periodical, same thing, is calqued on German word for periodical. The word for potatoes, tapuach adama, is coined, of course, on the French word pomme de terre, the apples of the earth. And there are many, many, many words like this. There are also direct borrowings from other languages, some of which were eventually replaced by Hebraized words. I gave you these words last time, telegrama, kultura, which were later replaced by words like mivrak and talbut. A lot of words were coined based on phonological resemblances. In fact, very often words that actually take, instead of being forgotten, are those words that sound like words you know in your native language. So the word for protocol, pratekol, was coined on the words for detail, prat and kol, everything. It sounds like protocol. And there are many examples of this in Hebrew. The repurposing of words with outdated or unclear meaning. And you're probably familiar with this if you've studied Hebrew. The word hashmal is used for electricity in modern Hebrew. It's a word from Ezekiel in the Bible. No one's quite sure what it means there. It refers perhaps to some kind of blinding blue light. It became the word, thanks to Ben Yehuda, I believe, for electricity. If you go to an anti-Zionist Haredi website, you'll see them big arguments about how Ben Yehuda and his colleagues created a new language that destroyed traditional Hebrew, traditional Lashon Kodesh, by corrupting words like hashmal to give it new secular meanings. Michonit, the contemporary word for car, one of the words we use for car today, actually is in the Bible referring to a kind of platform in which you put basins in the temple. It has nothing to do with a car or a machine, but it obviously sounds like a word like machine that people would know from European languages. There are plenty of acronyms like tapuz for tapuach zahav, for a golden apple, which becomes the word for orange, which is a major product of Israel. And of course, there are plenty of words that are coined in everyday life as a consequence of natural use, And this is going on all the time. And that's a sign that you have truly a living language, that children create new words and the army creates new words and so on and so forth every day. Now, what happens in the mandate period? This is very significant. By the mandate period, I mean the interwar period, the period between World War I and World War II, when the British have the official mandate for Palestine. Hebrew, Arabic, and English are recognized as official languages. This is a major coup. Hebrew, which was never recognized as an official language in 2,000 years, if it ever was an official language, who knows whether they had official languages 2,000 years ago, is now recognized as an official language, even though it only has a few tens of thousands of speakers, alongside Arabic with hundreds of thousands of speakers, and English, the language of an empire. The British are not really interested in interfering in everyday life in Palestine. They're mainly interested in their army and in oil in the surrounding region. They want to keep the peace. They allow the local population to run their own schools. What you get is a Jewish school system that functions in Hebrew. We see the birth of the Technion, which is finally opened in 1924 in Hebrew. The Hebrew University is opened in 1925. And here in the picture, you see laying the groundstone, the foundation stone of the Hebrew University in 1925. Why is it called the Hebrew University? Precisely because the language of instruction was Hebrew, and it was creating a new type of Jew who was a Hebrew. The prestige of Hebrew was growing at this time because it was recognized as an official language, because of ideology, because it was being used in society for public functions, for formal functions. And frankly, it was being heartily discouraged by groups like the Defenders of the Hebrew Language. This was a group of young people, particularly, began as high school students, who would go around yelling at people and interfering in their conversations and sometimes engaging in acts of violence if they caught you speaking a language other than Hebrew, particularly if they caught you speaking Yiddish, which was for them the worst of all languages, if they caught you speaking a diasporic language in public. They're famous for the statement, Ivrit daber Ivrit, Hebrew speak Hebrew. There's a famous story, a Jew arrived from Eastern Europe, and he was told he should stop, he was speaking Yiddish to his wife, and they told this to him and his wife said to him, what did they just say? What's this Ivrit daber Ivrit? And he translated it with husband, Yidret Yiddish, because the only way you could translate this statement into Yiddish is Jew, you should speak Jewish. Which of course is a joke making fun of this whole enterprise of censoring people for speaking languages other than Hebrew, but it was quite successful. I'll give you an example to the way it's still felt today, my own experience. One of my relatives who came from Romania in the 1970s to Israel, of course, he was a Yiddish speaker. We spoke to each other in Yiddish in private, but as soon as he entered the public sphere, as soon as we got on a bus or entered the street, he naturally switched to Hebrew speaking to me, even though the stigma of speaking Yiddish was no longer so great. There's an even better story I'll tell you about Max Weinreich, the famous Yiddish scholar. He went from Vilna to Palestine in 1935 to tour the settlements, and he encountered people there speaking Yiddish to each other. He didn't speak much Hebrew at the time. He asked them for directions. They answered him in Hebrew. It was one thing, and even though it was absurd, obviously, it was one thing to carry on a conversation amongst yourselves in Yiddish, but once a foreign party entered the situation, once it became a public discussion, people became accustomed to speaking Hebrew. Yiddish and diasporic languages were for the private sphere. Hebrew was for the public sphere. Now, of course, during this period, there was a massive increase in the Jewish population. Jews fleeing economic problems and anti-Semitism in Poland. And then, of course, in the 1930s, huge numbers of Jews fleeing Nazism. I won't review the history, but the numbers expand exponentially in this period. When they arrived, these people found already a Hebrew-speaking establishment and schools for their children. Hebrew had become Jews' intercommunal language. Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews and other Jews were now speaking Hebrew to each other. It was a natural process. apart from the ultra-Orthodox communities who really didn't go with Hebrew, it had become, for the secular majority, Hebrew had become a natural language of conversation and everyday affairs. Of course, diasporic languages continue to be widely spoken, but as I said, it was chiefly a private matter. You could go to a cafe in Tel Aviv in 1936, and you'd see the menus in Hebrew, and everything, the bill, everything else is in Hebrew, but you could probably order from the waiter in German. And certainly most of the people sitting at the cafe are probably speaking German. Somewhere else it might be with Russian, but you get the idea. Official sphere, public sphere, Hebrew, private sphere amongst your intimates, it's okay to speak your diasporic language. But certainly your children are going to become Hebrew speakers and speak more and more Hebrew at home. Now, what about the state of Israel? By the time the state of Israel was created in 1948, you really had the infrastructure of a Hebrew-speaking society that was well established. And now we have another massive wave of immigration. First, we have Holocaust survivors, especially from Eastern Europe, and then we have the Jews coming from Arab lands. Now, of course, at this point, Hebrew is not only the language of the infrastructure, the language of the establishment, the language of general society, it's also a language that unites Jews who share no other common language. Jews from Arabic-speaking lands, if they want to communicate with other Jews, are going to need to learn Hebrew and vice versa. You can't expect them to rely on other languages, and it's certainly not encouraged. The army obviously plays a huge role in Israeli society. It begins to introduce language instruction and primary education to recruits. After all, if you're going to serve in the army, which is an absolute necessity from the onset of the state of Israel, you have to be able to train and to follow commands. Now, they did at the lower units, often give instructions in the language that the soldiers understood, whether it was Yiddish, Russian, or something else. It was a matter of necessity, particularly in 1948. But the official language of the army and of all higher functions was Hebrew, and it was used as much as possible. In this period, shortly after the creation of the state, they introduced the idea of the ulpan, meaning studio. But really what they mean by that is the intensive immersion program for language learning. They begin to create 5-month ulpanim for all immigrants. They also, of course, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, create television with Hebrew subtitles. By the time that Israel introduces television, I can't tell you what decade, someone here might know, but certainly by the 1970s, when television is widespread, programs have Hebrew subtitles. They have easy Hebrew newspapers. There's the highbrow Hebrew press, but there's also the Hebrew press, like you see here, this is one example, that helps immigrants to learn the language. Now, today, of course, Israel is a Hebrew-speaking society. Many immigrant languages have disappeared. Only a few of them continue to be passed on to children to any significant extent. Those languages are the ones you probably can guess. Languages like English, Russian, and a few other world languages. Amharic is another one. But very few children, you can't imagine that Portuguese will survive after two generations in Israel. It's even hard to believe that Russian is going to survive indefinitely in Israel. By the second or third generation, the children are speaking less and less Russian, but English is widely encouraged for international value, and some of these languages are also encouraged because of their international value. But it's pretty clear these children will become Hebrew dominant speakers. Now I'm going to talk about some interesting features of Hebrew speech today and return to some of those theoretical questions I asked in the beginning in our remaining moments. First of all, the Hebrew that's spoken today, and this is quite remarkable, is largely the same everywhere, by which I mean it's the same language in terms of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. I'll talk about some ethnic differences in a minute, but by and large, native speakers of Hebrew speak with the same sound system. There are no dialects really in modern Hebrew. The people in Haifa and the people in Jerusalem and the people in Dimona all speak basically the same Hebrew Maybe there's a few words that are characteristic of one city as opposed to another one, but there's no Haifa dialect, there's no Tel Aviv dialect, really. Certainly not in the way they pronounce things. The language, in other words, is quite uniform. The non-Jewish population, of course, largely speaks Hebrew, as about 20% of the population of Israel is not Jewish. Everybody who comes to Israel, who goes to an Israeli school, and this includes a large number of the Arab citizens of Israel, they, of course, go to Israeli schools. They will acquire Hebrew. And to be integrated into society, to go to university and so on, you need to be able to speak good Hebrew. So Hebrew really is widely known by the entire population. There are exceptions, but it's widely known and spoken well. Now, of course, well is a relative concept, and this is where it gets complicated. Firstly, it brings us to the question of, is modern Hebrew really Hebrew? Is it the continuation of ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, as Ben Yehuda wanted? Or is it a modern Indo-European language? Or is it some kind of hybrid? The Hebrew that was revived is what we'll call lowest common denominator Hebrew, in the sense that the pronunciation is a compromise, script is a compromise, and grammar has undergone a large degree of simplification, at least in everyday speech. So what do I mean by this? The idea was to revive Hebrew. It was eventually agreed in the early 20th century that Hebrew should be revived with Sephardic pronunciation. This meant stress usually comes on the final syllable. It meant that you got away with, you use the Sephardic vowel system, which is less complicated than the Ashkenazic system. It meant that you had the consonants of Sephardic Hebrew. This is not what was really achieved. People could not pronounce all the sounds used by Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews. They really adopted a compromised form of speech that had all the sounds of a European language. Really, modern Hebrew has the sounds of Yiddish, because that's what most people could pronounce. It also has much of the rhythm and the melody of Yiddish. Not a big surprise, because some of the speakers were Yiddish speakers. Of course, there were other influences, but Yiddish played a really, what you might say, is a dominant role. So what do I mean? I'll give you a few examples. Well, let me say something about Ashkenazi script. They agreed on Sephardic pronunciation, but when you write Hebrew, and I mean the script, the cursive, you would use Ashkenazi, not Sephardic cursive. And the Sephardic pronunciation isn't exactly Sephardic pronunciation either. It's really this compromise I was talking about that everyone could pronounce. So sounds like an ayin as pronounced by Middle Eastern speakers. So you might hear it from Arabic speakers who know Hebrew. I can't do it well, but I'll try and do it. A word like pachim for flowers becomes pachim with a cha that you have in Yiddish or German. The ayin and the chet are not usually used by speakers of modern Israeli Hebrew, nor is a Middle Eastern style resh. You get more of a European, a Yiddish style resh in modern Hebrew. The revivers of the language, most of the people who were speaking it on an everyday basis, the school teachers and the children, were all coming from homes where Hebrew was obviously not spoken. Most of them were coming from Yiddish-speaking homes. Many of the teachers did not have a good knowledge of classic texts or Hebrew grammar. They were largely using Hebrew vocabulary, but with the syntax of other languages. And I'll illustrate some of this in just a moment. So you can imagine it's kind of like the French immersion case. Children speak French with the syntax of English, but with the words of French, or some kind of fusion of these two influences. So this revival of Hebrew by primarily European, speakers of European, not of Semitic languages, affected virtually every aspect of the language. It affected pronunciation, which I've already talked about. It affected stress. You look at first names. You have not Chana, but you have Chana, right? And you have many other names where the stress falls where you expect to find it in Yiddish or Ashkenazic Hebrew. The grammar, I'll give you an example, and just a couple of examples in a minute. Vocabulary is pretty obvious. Modern Hebrew is full of Yiddish terms and terms from Russian and other European languages. When I first got to Israel, I'd often just throw a Yiddish word into a sentence when I didn't know the word in Hebrew, and people usually understood me just fine. And in fact, often it was the only word they had. If I said gatkes for a long underwear, everybody knew what I was talking about. Idioms, man nishma. Of course, man nishma comes from Yiddish, which comes from Slavic languages. It's a direct translation into Yiddish from Polish and other Slavic languages. Man nishma, literally what is heard. This is not what someone would have said 2,000 years ago. Of course, it comes to mean what's going on, how are things. Hitlaot, for to see, for goodbye, is literally a translation of German Auf Wiedersehen, right? The European languages are disguised, in other words, with Hebrew elements. One of my favorite expressions, because it's from Yiddish, so I use it all the time, oseli et amavet, someone is driving you crazy. Literally, tit mir den Teut from Yiddish. These are many phrases that are now becoming obsolete in modern Hebrew. The younger generation uses these phrases far less than the older generations do, but there's still many of these direct translations in modern Israeli Hebrew. Of course, there are widespread borrowings from other languages, and this continues, and I mentioned that already. And there are many errors, in quotation marks, vis-a-vis the normative grammar of Hebrew. That is, the purists, the language specialists don't like this, but in everyday speech, people say things like chamish shekel, for 5 shekel. They don't they don't make the noun and the adjective, or rather the number and the noun agree for gender. They'll mix masculine and feminine when they're talking about numbers. Yesh li et sefer, right? Standard Hebrew is not supposed to have that et there. It's a direct translation of how European languages work. And I could talk more about this later if you're interested. This has become normal Hebrew. There are errors, but they're normal Hebrew speech. Now, do Israelis really understand the Bible? This was a question that was asked very often because modern Hebrew is often billed as the language that's a direct continuation of the Bible. Israelis pride themselves that they can pick up the Bible and read it without assistance. Is this really the case? Now, obviously, the ancient prophets would not understand modern Hebrew. But what about the reverse? The sound system of modern Hebrew would be too foreign to the ancient prophets. But would the ancient prophets understand the grammar, and do today's Israelis understand the grammar of ancient Hebrew? Well, there's a whole debate about this. There's this famous linguist, I mentioned Zuckerman, who claims they don't. I think this is not so different from the case of us reading Chaucer in English. We need some help. Israelis think they know the Bible because they've been taught it. But there are many instances where Israelis misunderstand a certain word or a verb tense because modern Hebrew does not use the word with a different meaning and uses verbs differently. But once they're taught it in school, they internalize it, they learn how it works. There are some pronunciation differences that exist today that show us differences in social class that often correspond with ethnicity. They're disappearing, but they still exist. You can still find very often Jews of Mizrahi background speaking with the sounds of Arabic that the Ashkenazi Jews do not produce, but more and more their children, their grandchildren sound just like the Ashkenazi Jews. The irony of all this is that for a long time, Mizrahi speech was considered better speech from the purists, and they wouldn't allow native Israeli speech that you hear today to be used in television and radio because it was considered corrupt. Eventually, I believe by the 1950s, they began to allow radio broadcasts with the native accent that had developed. Now, if I take this to the diaspora, there's something interesting that I'll mention. We have primarily in the diaspora, the persistence of diasporic pronunciations. What I mean by this is in Haredi communities, you'll still find Ashkenazi pronunciation. Even in Israel, you'll find very often Haredi communities speak Hebrew for everyday life, but when they pray and pronounce texts, they'll use Ashkenazi pronunciation. In North America, you have this interesting pronunciation, unique to North America, which is something like Israeli Hebrew, with the difference that the tzere vowel, the a vowel, which is often usually realized as an in modern Hebrew, is a. So I'm trying to think of an example, and of course I'm not going to have one. but there's a few vowels that you'll hear in North American synagogues that are different from Israeli synagogues or Israeli everyday speech, apart from the general North American consonants. Okay, many Haredim in Israel do not want to speak Israeli Hebrew because they consider it a desecration of the holy language. But over time, they become quite accustomed to it. But they can rationalize this, they can justify it. They're not speaking Lashon Kodesh, the holy language. They're speaking the language of the secularists, Israeli Hebrew. This has made it possible for Israeli Hebrew to be adopted as an everyday language by many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel. Ironically, there's in some cases what we might call a triglossia, 3 languages in Israeli society, in the Haredi community. People speak Israeli Hebrew in everyday life. They use Lashon Kodesh, the holy language, for prayer and study. And they use Yiddish as a new form of a holy language. If you listen to shiurim, if you listen to lessons by the yeshivas in Israel on YouTube, you'll very often hear them speaking fluent Israeli Hebrew, but when they get to a specific word like Shabbos, they necessarily say Shabbos because it's a significant term with Judaic value. They'll say it with the Yiddish or Ashkenazi pronunciation. And these lectures are full of these Yiddish terms, even when they're actually just Hebrew words. The last thing I'll just mention here, before I get to my final slide, is Samaritan Hebrew still exists. The Samaritans have their own version of Hebrew, using it in their own script. That is, even in Israel, there's more than one Hebrew, even if there's one dominant form of Hebrew. The last thing I'd like to talk about, and you'll indulge me for just another minute, I know I'm going on a bit long, is the question of, is Hebrew a Jewish language? And then in order to answer this question, we have to talk about what is a Jewish language. Jewish language scholars have worked backwards. They've looked at the various Jewish diasporic languages, they've extrapolated, they come up with a number of criteria that these languages share. Then they try to apply it to modern Hebrew. First of all, they consider Jewish languages languages with a minority status. Obviously, modern Hebrew does not really qualify as that because it's the language of the state, the language of the majority of society. Jewish languages are traditionally in a diglossic relationship with Hebrew. Obviously, modern Hebrew is not in this situation because it's not a diglossic relationship. It's the language people use for everything. Traditional Jewish languages have a Lashon Kodesh component. They have Hebrew Aramaic words in them. There is some of this in modern Hebrew, but not as much as in the Jewish languages. They're built upon a legacy of Jewish languages. Arguably, modern Hebrew is built upon a legacy of Jewish languages. It's Yiddish fused with Hebrew and some other things to create a new language. What about the perception of the speakers? Usually Jewish languages are spoken almost exclusively by Jews and are perceived by their speakers and by non-Jews as the Jews' language. They're called Jewish, hence Yiddish is called Jewish. Whereas Hebrew is a language spoken by Jews and non-Jews nowadays, even though most people perceive it as a Jewish language. Finally, there is the question of the role in Jewish identity. Traditional Jewish vernaculars are conceived of as very important to the maintenance of Jewish identity as symbols of Jewish identity. Arguably, this is the case too. There are many Israeli Jews who define themselves first as Jewish and then as Israeli, and see Hebrew as a very important part of their Jewish identities, not just as part of their Israeli identities. Now, we could play with these categories for a long time. I could come up with very interesting formulations. I think at the end of the day, everyone would argue, though, or most people would argue, that Jews perceive Hebrew as a Jewish language, as do most non-Jews, and that, well, I forgot the point I was going to make about the perceptions of Hebrew, but I'll leave it there, that Hebrew continues to be seen as a Jewish language. It is the language of a minority. After all, Jews are a small minority in the world, and Israel is surrounded by a region where their language is not being spoken. So in many ways, you can turn these criteria on their head and make an argument for Hebrew being a Jewish language. And I think most people make the argument that Hebrew is largely the inheritor of biblical Hebrew, even if it's changed over time, because of course, all languages change over time. And perhaps no language is as close to its ancestor from 2,000 years ago as is biblical Hebrew. So in that sense, Eliezer ben Yehuda and his comrades really did succeed. And there has never been a case like this in modern history, the revival of the language in this way. And it's remarkable. And that's where I'm going to end for now. And I am very happy to entertain your questions and your comments. Thank you for your patience. I went on a little bit too long. I apologize.
I don't think anybody minds that you went too long. It was not too long, and you could probably listen to some more. But any thoughts? Well, first of all, you seem to not be able to find a word with a. So the most famous one that I can think of right off is Hineni. When God says to Abraham, "Where are you?" He said, Hineni. It's a very common word. In Israeli, would say Hineni.
That's right. Yes.
Hineni,
Yeah.
Hineni. Tishlecheni. It's very common.
Yeah, right. Elokeinu versus Elokenu. Yeah. Of course, it's easy when someone else mentions the words, but you forget when you're talking. It's such a common vowel.
If you have a yud following it, it's a different story. So
right.
Eloheinu has the yud, so I don't think you would say Elohenu.
Okay.
It doesn't sound
Thank
good.
you.
So, but if it's a tzere without a yud following, then you have the difference.
Right.
Whether you say hineni or hineni.
Right.
And anybody who wants a course in Hebrew, give me a call later.
I'll tell you something interesting for me, at least. My mother's family is from Greece, and they have their own pronunciation of Hebrew. They actually pronounce a taf as a tha. So for instance, you know how all these synagogues are Beth Tikva and so on? And in modern Hebrew, it's Bet Tikva and so on. She would actually say Beth, and she said Talith. And wherever you had a TH in these romanizations in English, she genuinely had a TH in her pronunciation. Matzoth.
That is very unusual.
Yeah, and that's really dying out.
Thank God. By the way, somebody pointed in the chat that you have a mistake in one of your early slides. You showed the son of Ben Yehuda dying some years before he was born. I think it should be in 1953, not 1853.
Thank you.
So
I will correct that. Thank you. I'm going to look in the chat. I see a few things, and I see Sid also has his hand up. His date's right. Yes, he could have been born in 1882 and died in 1850. 1850. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so I'm going to end. Deborah has a question, and I see a hand up. I can't see everybody's hands, but if you write in the chat, I can see what you have to say. I was wondering about the Hebrew of pre-Israeli writers like Aglon and Brenner. Are they widely understood by Israelis today? I think Meir may be better able to answer this question than I am. My understanding is they are, but except for scholars, most people don't like reading them. That the Hebrew at this point sounds a bit old, outdated. The Hebrew style has changed. Really, there's a difference in the style as soon as people are really speaking it as their native language and an everyday language, it becomes its own animal. In fact, there's this famous case that even in the 1890s, Hebrew that was being revived in Europe was already going in a different direction from Hebrew that was being revived in Palestine amongst the people who were speaking it in everyday language. So I think the short answer is yes, they can understand it, especially if they studied the writers in school. It's not a wholly foreign language, but it sounds to them funny the way reading something from the 1880s or 1890s or 1910 might sound to our generations today.
Okay, I think Sid has his hand out for a while. So Sid, you want to speak?
Well, sort of two half a comment, half a question. So the th issue, those are like the final texts, right? In words, they become an S in Yiddish. So besemes.
In Ashkenazic Hebrew, yes. Yeah.
Or an Ashkenazic Hebrew. So that, the Greek version and the Ashkenazic version are not that dissimilar, the th and the s sound.
No, they're not dissimilar in function. Absolutely. That is Yemenite Hebrew, Ashkenazic Hebrew, many dialects of Hebrew, with the exception of Sephardic Hebrew, preserve a distinction between a taf with the dagesh, with the dot, and without it.
Yeah.
But modern Israeli Hebrew took on the Sephardic variant that didn't preserve a distinction.
Right.
But how that distinction was observed varies from all these languages, right? That's why you have the tha versus the sa. Exactly.
And then another sort of story and comment. So I think one of the things that happened is that biblical Hebrew, and I think I've got the word right, is very agglutinating. In other words, you add meanings by sticking prefixes and suffixes onto words. And modern Hebrew, more like English, because German is agglutinating as well, but modern Hebrew, you just it's more like English, you break up concepts into different words.
Yes. Yes.
So there's a funny story that I heard about Bialik, who spoke very highfalutin Hebrew, and when he moved to Tel Aviv, at one point went to a street vendor asking for soda, and he said in his highfalutin Hebrew, "Gazozeni ve'egaresh," which nobody understood, but if you break it down, it's "give me gazoz, gazozeni, ve'egaresh, I will give you a grush, a penny."
Right.
But no one can understand him because it would be 10 li gazoz, 10 lecha grush is how people would say it, or something like that.
Right.
So,
right.
So
that's absolutely right. This is one of the arguments why for many scholars who argue that essentially, and there's a whole, I didn't get into this because there's just not enough time, but there are scholars who really see Hebrew as a European language with Semitic words, that the grammar is too Europeanized. And there, of course, there are counter arguments to this, but the whole, what you get as registers, the agglutinative functions are usually reserved for highfalutin Hebrew, which still exists, of course, but for everyday speech, you have less of it. And that way, you do have this grammatical simplification. Of course, when you look at biblical Hebrew, all we have is the texts. We don't know what people actually said in the streets. So, right, these are all arguments based on really interesting academic arguments that may be divorced from reality both then and now. So take it with a grain of salt.
Joel has his hand up.
I see Joel's question in the chat.
Okay.
I like hearing the guttural ayin and chet as spoken by Yemenite and other Mizrahi Jews in Israel. Is there an effort to stop these guttural sounds in modern Hebrew?
I love it. I guess I hadn't understood it as well till you gave the context that we took the Sephardi pronunciation, but got rid of all the parts that were hard for the Ashkenazi Jews. Whenever I hear an ayin or chet, from back in the throat, I say, wow, that's what we should be doing. But what's the policy for that?
There's no official policy of, forcing people to get these things out of their mouths. But I'll tell you an interesting story. It's a famous story that when My Fair Lady came out in Israel, the way they handled it, it's all about language. They had Eliza Doolittle speaking with a Mizrahi accent, with Mizrahi pronunciation. And no, hold on a second. No, I'm getting it wrong. They had the professor speaking with Mizrahi pronunciation, and Eliza Doolittle was speaking, regular Israeli everyday Hebrew. And someone asked her father, who was a linguist, "Daddy, why does the Professor Higgins speak like our cleaning lady?" That is, there's a social disincentive. The lower socioeconomic classes in Israel were associated with the pronunciation that was considered correct pronunciation. But in everyday prestige, people didn't recognize them, value this, because they were Mizrahi, they were Mizrahi Jews. So, this discouraged people from speaking like them. Their children certainly especially 2 generations later, don't speak like them usually, unless they want to assert their Mizrahi identity. It's not, it's for academic purists, it's a source of pride. But for everyday life, it marks you as, socioeconomically of a lower caste, for lack of a better word.
Was there
that may change over time, but that's kind of the way it is, as I understand it.
So the guttural distinguishes the ayin, say, from the aleph, and also the chet from the chaf. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
what
right.
about the tet and the taf in the Mizrahi?
No. A tet is a tet, and a taf is either a ta or something else. I'm not sure what they use. And there's also the issue of the resh. A resh versus something else.
So I can enlighten you a bit.
Yeah, please.
I lived in a small town in Israel called Migdal. There used to be a Majdal in Arabic. And by the way, Arabic Israelis speak Hebrew with that accent because that's how Arabic is spoken. So ayin and het and the taf and a tet, the Yemenites separated, like it's a ta and a ta, lighter, there's a kuf and a kaf, ka and ka. So when I was from the age of 6 to 11, I lived in a small town in Israel with many ma'abarot.
The transit camps.
The transit camps, and who lived there, Moroccan Jews and Yemenite Jews. And I went to school with them, and I learned to speak like them. And then we moved to Bnei Barak, and when we would go and visit, and I was speaking to my parents, and people would ask them, why is he speaking like a Yemenite? And I knew, that's how I used to speak. And by the way, before, like in the 50s, if you were a radio broadcaster, the standard was to speak like that. You spoke. Really? So for those who want to hear it, like a chaf is a chaf, like lech, and hai, like hai. You don't say chai, but hai, very, very deep in the throat. And
what about tet and taf? Can you distinguish that for me?
Tet and taf is, I never did tet and taf. It's not so common. I think that's hard. No, I can't do it. I think somebody has to be a native Arabic or some. I think the Arabic languages use that.
Right. Though all these distinctions are preserved or exist because they existed in the vernacular languages that Jews brought with them from the diaspora. So Yemenite Hebrew shares a phonology with the Arabic they spoke. Yiddish shares a phonology with Ashkenazi Hebrew. So, that's why it is the way it is.
Where did the guttural resh come from? Sorry, my last question. The guttural resh. Our grandson goes, he speaks Hebrew, but he goes to an English daycare, but his R's, it's so strong.
You mean the mainstream Israeli resh? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Where did that come from?
It's a resh used commonly in European languages.
Wow.
Yeah. Shirley Segev, I should say, notes in the comments, ayin and chet are definitely in. It is softer, but definitely there. These things they're certainly not stigmatized. They're diminished, but they're present, and some people use it more than others.
I can tell you when I chant the Torah, I deliberately do it to some extent. I don't try to overdo it because it's going to drive people crazy, but I do distinguish, and I like to think that some people notice.
Yeah, I see Ruth and Paul Pascal are asking, in Soviet Bukhara, I found a Hebrew. This is great, Soviet Bukhara. Last week when I was in Soviet Bukhara, I found a Hebrew. I found a Hebrew that seemed a combo of Mizrahi, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi. Do you know anything about this? Unfortunately, I don't. You'd have to get a real expert to talk to you about that. I can tell you that I had many pleasant encounters with Bukharian hairdressers, barbers in Jerusalem when I was a student. And then I came back to New York and I met their cousins, because the Bukharian Jews in both Israel and New York largely went into haircutting. So I could have the same conversation on two sides of the continent in Hebrew with the Bukharians, which was a nice plus.
So, a question. You just noted how things developed and everything worked well, but it did it take some act of parliament to say Hebrew is the language of Israel? How did that come to be? Was it general? Was there a discussion?
This was look. First of all, you have to understand. People think that language is fixed. Language is always changing. It's dynamic. All these processes are unfolding all the time. It's, I'm giving you major highlights and points to simplify what's really a complicated living organism. So you have to take things, understanding in that light. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened with amazing speed, given the time frame we're talking about. But it was all at a grassroots level, voluntarily, prior to the existence of the state, or at least prior to the mandate period. Hebrew had no official force prior to the mandate period. People were doing this because they believed in the ideology and they accepted the social pressures. There were, of course, Yiddishists and others in Palestine who rejected this, and they suffered the consequences. Either there was social ostracism, or there was violence, a certain amount of violence, such as throwing, stink bombs in theaters showing a Yiddish movie, or throwing things at speakers in Yiddish, or even maybe, actual violence against their bodies. This did happen, although on a small scale. The state, when it came into power, of course, it pronounced that Hebrew was one of the official languages of the state. Hebrew was not declared the only official language of the state, but it had a whole system operating in Hebrew, and this was accepted. It wasn't questioned by that point. The issue in 1927, they attempted to create a chair for Yiddish at the newly founded Hebrew University, and the motion was vetoed primarily by Eastern European Zionists. That is, the native Yiddish speakers at the Hebrew University did not want a Yiddish chair. Yiddish represented too many things that were negative, and it was too much of a threat still. There was still too much concern that if you got a massive wave of Eastern European immigration, this whole Hebrew endeavor could be drowned. It was only after the Holocaust in 1949 that they actually decided that it was appropriate to create a chair in Yiddish, because Yiddish was no longer a threat. It was now the language that had been martyred. Hebrew had been established enough that Yiddish could be entertained as a language that had an important contribution to Jewish culture, but it was not going to be the dominant language of society. They also, by the way, were going to create a chair for Ladino, but they didn't get around to it for a bunch of reasons. They did create the chair for Yiddish by, I think, 1952. So it was really a grassroots organic movement by people who were zealots in a sense. And then it became the language of the state. But by that time, no one doubted it. No one questioned it. There were Bundists who were upset about this. But even the Bundists tended to say, okay, they used to call it Lakshan Kodesh, holy noodles, instead of Lushan Kodesh. But they were, they created the state, not us. They were offended by the idea that Israel should be the one locus of Jewish civilization. They didn't love Hebrew, but they accepted it as a reality. Actually, I did want to tell you a story that puts things in light related to some of the things I mentioned before. They've tried to use many of these techniques on indigenous languages, for example, in New Zealand. The difference being that you actually have people who are native speakers of the local languages there. Whereas obviously in Israel, you did not have in 1870 native speakers. They use the school system, creating schools where the children will learn through immersion and the idea that they'll speak it with their families and then in everyday life. And they introduce the children who are the products of these schools, these immersion schools, at some point to native speakers, elderly native speakers. And the elderly native speakers were very upset. Why were they very upset? Because the language the children were speaking did not sound like the language they spoke. It had the same words, but didn't have the right pronunciation necessarily. And certainly the way they constructed sentences and their idioms did not sound like that language. It was the French immersion effect, in other words. Speaking French with the syntax and idioms of English in translation. But if you can accept that that's how language revival works, why not? You think about English. English was heavily influenced by the Vikings. Probably English grammar is deeply simplified because the Vikings came, conquered England, settled in England at least, and learned English as adults. And adults have trouble learning language, so they simplify the grammar. They teach the simplified grammar to their children. And of course, no one says there's something wrong with English simply because our verbs are so simplified as compared with more than 1,000 years ago. So, this is just the natural order of language development as far as I'm concerned, even if things are at times artificially resurrected.
Well, all that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Kalman. I'd like to take maybe 30 seconds to advertise our next Israel program. And Shirley, who is here in a little box on my right, is going to lead that session. It's going to be a little bit more political, and it's going to focus on who is Mansour Abbas in his Ram party. They are now in a situation where it's the first time in history of Israel that an Arab party is part of the ruling coalition in the Knesset. If they don't like something, they can vote against the coalition and the bill does not pass, and they can actually, if they get upset enough, then the coalition will fall. So what are they all about? What do they want? Are they good for the Jews? and that'll be, I believe it's February 9th. February 9th, same Wednesday. So
Wednesday, 7:30.
Yeah. So hope to see you all here. It will be a little bit more political and a little bit more current, but worth listening to. So thank you all for attending today, and thank you, Kalman.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you coming out tonight or staying home tonight and listening.